that last summer I was privileged to join President Obama, then Senator Obama, on his second visit to Israel. I followed him as he studied each wall at Yad Vashem. I looked on from a distance as he slipped a personal prayer into the stones of the Western Wall, the Kotel. I witnessed the courage and endurance of the citizens of Sderot and touched the remnants of the countless Hamas rockets that are their ever-present terror. I've made several trips myself to Israel, but my most vivid memories are from my very first visit when I was just 14 years old, at a very different time in this nation's history. I came with my younger brother and my father, who was then on the board of directors of what was known as Trans World Airlines, TWA, as many of you will recall. The board members and their families, I included, had the extraordinary experience of being passengers on one of the very first flights from Tel Aviv to Cairo around the time of the Camp David Accords. On that same trip, I will never forget visiting the original Yad Vashem, floating in the Dead Sea, walking the old city, climbing at Masada, and my first experience of a kibbutz. I learned by heart the sacred prayer, the Shema, which speaks of God's oneness. And since that first wonderful visit, my admiration for Israel has grown ever stronger. I have another powerful memory from that same time. I was born and raised in Washington, D.C., where my mother's house is still across the street from the Egyptian embassy. So I recall seeing Anwar al-Sadat as he got out of his motorcade, triumphant, proud, and sure, having just signed the Camp David Accords. As a kid, I was more impressed by the heavily armed Secret Service agents who were standing on our roof. But as an adult, I am most impressed by the central lesson that Sadat's actions taught me, that human conflict and human problems can be ended by human courage. And that lesson, in a sense, is what has brought me back to Jerusalem today. President Perez has asked us here, in the words of the conference's theme, to face tomorrow. He has asked me to talk about the ways that the United States and the State of Israel and the world can turn crisis into opportunity. That's a daunting task, Mr. President, but allow me to describe the vision of the world that President Obama believes lies within our grasp, if we have the courage to seize it. And I will then offer some thoughts on what it will require from all of us to get there. The right place to start is with a common vision, not of some distant future, but of the world we seek for our children and our grandchildren. Our view of that world is rooted in a truth that my nation has long held to be self-evident, and that is that all people are created equal, of equal worth, of equal consequence, and with equal rights. To be sure, my own country has struggled for centuries to make this promise real, a struggle that is never truly done. But that has only made the promise matter still more. Even as a 14-year-old girl, watching from my window as Sadat marched into his place in history, I felt I had permission to dream, to be whatever I wanted to be. That's not something to take for granted. Like President Obama, I am among the first generation of African Americans whose dreams were not immediately circumscribed by institutionalized racism and legalized segregation. And thus, as we did, children everywhere should have the freedom to dream without limits and to be limited only by their abilities. Children everywhere should be able to get a good education and forge a dignified future, unbound by the accidental circumstances of their birth. This is a belief that is deeply rooted in the American experience, but it's also one with universal power. We cannot afford to write off vast swaths of the world as somehow marginal or irrelevant or doomed. We wouldn't tolerate it for our own children, and we shouldn't accept it for someone else's. The belief that we all matter equally, that every person is created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God, that belief carries powerful implications. It means that no child should be left to drown in conflict and despair. It means that, in a moral sense, all of our fates are bound together. But this bedrock belief in human equality and human dignity also has powerful geopolitical implications in our interconnected age. It drives us toward a foreign policy that is principled and pragmatic, one that recognizes not only the moral claim placed upon us by our common humanity, but also the strategic realities that we face in our interlinked world. Today, transnational security threats such as terrorism, nuclear proliferation, pandemics, and climate change can cross borders as freely as a storm. So the days when we could view our own interests in isolation are over. The days when we could focus on our own security and prosperity without regard for that of others is past. More and more, our fates are bound closer together. More and more, we live in a world where we rise and fall together, where zero-sum politics no longer fit today's hard realities, where what's good for others is often good for us. A realistic view of the world thus requires an ambitious approach to the world. We must tackle the great problems that we face together. We must find cooperative solutions to challenges that pay no heed to borders. We must think strategically rather than just acting tactically. And we must recognize that there's a growing sphere where our interests and our values converge. The United States has a clear vision of the future we hope to build together with partners around the globe. A future that rests on the values that underpin the American creed, and a future that we can only create if we stand together. We seek a world in which government is a means to advance human rights, not a tool to suppress them. A world where violent extremism is rejected, whether from Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, or others. A world where nuclear danger, climate change, hunger, poverty, disease, and illiteracy are beaten back, and where access to education and opportunity rises. A world where we have finally learned the lessons of the Holocaust, of Rwanda, of Darfur, where we put effective action behind the words "never again" by finally ending genocide. A world where governments rid their schools and their textbooks of lies about those who are different, including slurs about Zionism, the Jewish people, or any religious, racial, and ethnic group. a world where women and girls fulfill their own potential and are indispensable to national growth and development. A world of liberty and prosperity, of greater decency, dignity, and democracy. A world where a child can grow up in Gaza, in Tel Aviv, in Baghdad, in Bamako, or in Kabul, free of fear, free of want, and with the opportunity to live their dreams. All of this would, of course, be in America's interests and in Israel's interests. But it also reflects the common aspirations of people around the globe. Now, we have no illusions that building this world will be quick or easy, but the difficulty of the task must not serve as an excuse for inaction. We know what is holding us back: short-term, short-sighted definitions of self-interest. Governments that view power, resources, and markets simply as zero-sum competitions. Countries that suffer from weak governance and corrupt institutions that fail their citizens. And leaders who value their own grip on power above the interests of their own people. By indulging old habits, we run new risks. We know which way the trend lines point: toward a world of unchecked nuclear proliferation, a world in which violent extremists continue to menace us all, a Middle East roiled by conflict and radicalized by despair, a world where strife and genocide claim the lives of more innocents, a world of bitter division between the haves and the have-nots, and a planet driven ever closer to the brink of environmental disaster. So the status quo, ladies and gentlemen, is not static at all. Treading water above powerful undertows will only leave us driven farther and farther from shore. And that is why President Obama often speaks of what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called the fierce urgency of now, of the pressing need to grasp opportunities that will soon pass us by. Inertia in the face of great challenges carries even greater dangers. If we fail to take bold action to solve common problems, we will all be left at greater peril. So we must choose to continue business as usual in a vain attempt to withstand the whirlwind, or to work together to seize this rare chance for deep and lasting change. Change driven by transformational leadership, reinforced by partners with the will to seek lasting progress, embedded in effective institutions, and supported by visionary citizens and publics who understand our mission and our moment. We all have a great deal of work to do to make this change real. The United States has truly changed course, but this task cannot be America's alone. To pursue this future, we need to act on the belief that our interests are mutual and forge global responses to pressing global challenges.